Hello pushers, welcome to Pushing Cardboard number 40. I've got another big episode this time, even though it's only been a couple weeks since the last one. I did a bunch of interviews down in San Diego and I want to get them released while they're still relatively fresh. So here we go. This time out, you'll hear from designer and author Maurice Suckling. His most recent game is Operation Barkley, and he also has a great new book, Paper Time Machines. And then you'll also hear from Justin Fassino. Some of you may already know him as Justagard on YouTube. He has his first ever design ready to come out from GMT. It's called Seljuk Byzantium Besieged. I thought it'd be interesting to speak with someone having their first game published and going through the P500 system for the first time. But I'm not forgetting to have a look at a new game, or a game anyway. This time around, it's Espana 1936. It's De Veer's beautiful new edition of their 2007 game of the same name. And of course, we'll have a bit of news, new additions to the collection, and whatever else crosses my mind. This episode of Pushing Cardboard is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. If there's a game you need, they've got it. They're a treasure trove of out-of-print games you'd given up hope of ever finding. I encourage you to try them out. And if you do, please use the link found in either the newsletter or on the website. That way I'll get a little kickback and be able to feed my addiction. And then I'll tell you about a game and you can decide if it's time to feed your addiction. Win-win for both of us. News. Well, not really news, but last episode I forgot to mention Pushing Cardboard had its third anniversary while I was down in San Diego. So last episode was actually the first episode of Season 4. Huzzah! Speaking of last episode, I noted that GMT had dropped the P500s for two items in Carl Paradise's No Retreat series. I wondered if it meant no more No Retreat at GMT or no more No Retreat anywhere. Carl let me know that the P500 numbers had been sluggish, but also that he didn't lob GMT very hard on their behalf, and that his focus had gone to his new Napoleonic game. That said, there is still a new edition of No Retreat number 1, the Russian front, coming out from GMT. And Carl went on to say that he's looking for a way to publish his new version of No Retreat number 2, North Africa, as it has some changes that he's excited about. No definite plans for an update kit anymore, as GMT is out of the picture on that one. But who knows, maybe C3I magazine would be interested? Carl is definitely still interested in this series, but it's up in the air if it will land with a new publisher. And here's another bit of Pushing Cardboard news. Just as we are an affiliate of Noble Knight, we are also an affiliate of the excellent storage solution wizards Cube for Me. Check out the website or newsletter for my link. Use it to order their trays and then they'll know I sent you. They're in Poland, but I was amazed at how reasonable the shipping was. Oh, and more about Pushing Cardboard. There's a poll up asking what are your favorite games from the past 2 years. It's in the poll section on the website. Check it out. You can log in beforehand or not. It doesn't require being registered to take part. I switched to best games of the past 2 years last time instead of just the best games of the past year, as I found so many players responded that they just hadn't played the newest games yet. So this gives you a little more time. New games to the collection. Well, this list is much shorter as this episode is coming out so soon after the previous one. In fact, there's just one game. My Kickstarter edition of Tactical Commander from Trafalgar Editions just arrived. It's a World War II East Front tactical card game. I'm not at all sure how it works. There's a board, but there's also cards for the units and then counters that correspond to the cards and these counters go on the boards. I don't know. It looks very interesting. I can't wait to try it out. Okay, on to the first interview. I should note before we go that these interviews were audio only, so those of you listening to this on YouTube will have to make do with whatever images I throw up on the video, but I hope the conversation remains interesting all the same. Justin Fassino. Well, many of you YouTube fans will know Justin from his channel under the name Justagard. I love his videos on conventions where he walks the floor and looks at what everyone else is playing, talks to the players, very much like a TV man on the street style interview. But Justin is also a designer and is soon to have his first design finally published, Seljuk Byzantium Besieged. It's in art and final edits at GMT. I thought it'd be interesting to speak with a designer going through the publishing process for the first time. So here's our conversation. Hello, we're coming to you from San Diego HISCON. I'm here with Justin Fassino, and Justin's going to be a first-time designer, first-time published designer. Anyway, how are you, Justin?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great.
Yeah.
You're working on a Levian campaign game.
Yeah.
What's the Seljuk is the name?
Seljuk Byzantium Besieged.
Right. So that's it. That's interesting. Right off the bat, like what
You're a young guy. What's got you interested in the Byzantium period?
Yeah, well, I'm not that young, first of all, but Byzantium. So I don't know. I feel like I feel like right now, just kind of like there's like this kind of cultural resurgence of like the history of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, and I don't necessarily know what's driving it, but there just seems to be like a much bigger interest in the topic suddenly in like the last 10 years, maybe even less than that. You know what got me interested in it? I think there's something kind of tragic, like when you think about the Byzantine Empire, there's something kind of tragic about it, right? Like it comes out of the Western Roman Empire. It's a continuation of the Roman Empire, you know, after the West falls, and it lasts for another 1,000 years, basically, with, you know, continuing sort of like that identity of being Roman, right, all the way up to what most people, I guess, would consider the start of the or the end of the Middle Ages or the medieval period, and the fact that like it's not around anymore, like the empire is gone, the culture is gone, like elements of it still exist, or basically Orthodox Christianity and all that stuff, but like, you know, this spirit of this empire that came from Rome and managed to persist, and then it was all gone, and like all we have of it are archaeological traces and documentary traces. There's not like one culture or person, you know, that you could point to that says like, oh, this was the inheritors of the Byzantine Empire. I think there's just something kind of like romantic and tragic about that. So yeah, I mean, personally, that's kind of why I got interested in it. And also, there's a fantastic podcast called The History of Byzantium that was started as a response and continuation to the history of Rome.
Right, Duncan's great podcast. Yeah,
exactly. So Robin, the host of History of Byzantium, was like, well, he basically was like, I want to know what happens after 476. Like, what comes next? And so he was like, I'm going to do that. And he does an incredible job. It's really well produced. He's got a great voice for podcasting and radio, and he does a great job, I think, and this is one of the reasons why I think wargamers maybe are starting to pay more attention to Byzantium, is that he does a really good job of making a narrative history out of it. It's not just the dates and places and people, it's the story of the empire, and I think that's really compelling, right? It's very dramatic, and games kind of give us that same thing. So in my mind, I was like, why aren't there more games about this topic? You know, so rich for material, there's so few, and it's 1,000 years of history.
1,000 years. So the game you're working on, at what point in that 1,000-year arc is your game set? Yeah,
so it is set between the years of 1068 and 1071, which is actually a very natural historical bookend, especially for Levy and Campaign. Obviously, Levy and Campaign, if you've played it before, is you're taking the role of kind of a faction, and they have all these individual personalities that lead the armies, the lords of Levy and Campaign. They really drive all the action. So it's already a very personal focused scope of the game. And 1068 to 1071 would be what most people would consider sort of the end of the last quote unquote golden age of the empire. So 1068, January 1st, is when the Emperor Romanos IV becomes Roman Emperor. And he's the emperor when the Battle of Manzikert happens, which is probably the most famous battle, one of the most famous battles in Byzantine history, in 1071. And he's captured, right? He's one of the few Roman emperors who's ever been captured in battle, right? And so that 4-year period is a perfect bookend for a game about people, because really, ostensibly, the game is about him and the Sultan, his enemy, Alp Arslan, because that 4-year period is sort of the heyday of their rule and their operations and stuff.
And it fits like right smack in the middle almost of the
Levy and Campaign,
and of the Byzantine Empire, right? Sort of like 500 to 1500, roughly.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And also the Battle of Manzikert, obviously, is sort of a lot of historians and just point to the Battle of Manzikert as sort of the very first moment that started this slow cycle, right? It wasn't linear; it was kind of up and down, but the slow cycle of decline until 1453. It was the last time, prior to Manzikert, was the last time that the interior of Anatolia was Byzantine. After that, they only really have control of the coastal regions around the Anatolian Peninsula. So it's a very important point in terms of the empire, and also, and I don't want to neglect the Turkish side of this, the Seljuk Empire's rise, right? The Seljuks move in, the Turks settle Anatolia, and they have never left since. The reason Turkey is Turkey now in Turkish is because, partially because the Battle of Manzikert was a defeat.
And, well, right, so when they were when it finally all ended, the Turks took over the area, but they weren't called the Turks at that time.
Yeah, so this is where researching the history, I wanted to make sure that the history of both sides it was accurately reflected. We know a lot about the Byzantine side because we have historical writings, archaeological evidence, and stuff. But at this time in history, the Seljuk Empire, which starts in the late 900s, really, they don't have their own writing system. So everything we really know about this period of medieval history about the Turks and the Seljuk specifically, which was sort of a familial clan that grew to power, comes from Arabs, the Arab scholars. And because the Turks emerged from Muslim religion, right? They converted, and because they came out of the Arab courts in places like Mosul and Baghdad and like the heart of the Arab regions, Muslim regions, a lot of what we know from their early period, which is the 11th century, is the early period, right? We know far more about them once they've established themselves in the 1100s and 1200s, and you think about the Seljuk Empire and their golden age. That's much further ahead of this, but this is still early, so it's hard to find direct historical accounts of what they're doing. They didn't have a written language. Some of the earliest documents and chronicles of Seljuks are Arab historians and chroniclers and religious scholars translating essentially what they hear orally about the Turks from them directly or from other Arab scholars, and then writing it down. So you're kind of getting a little bit of a diffusion of the reality. So it's kind of a murky origination. We know the people, we don't necessarily know how. We don't know how they got so big or so powerful necessarily. I mean, there's some evidence for that, but yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that was represented because they're not a monolithic political group. You've got the Sultan, right, which is a title given to him by the Abbasid Caliph, the head of the Muslim religion, who at this point is more of a figurehead rather than an actual political power. All the political and military power is with the Seljuks. But there is still a religious element, kind of like if you imagine the Pope in Christianity, where he's like the religious head of the Western world, but he's not the military, that's kind of that, a little parallel. And so the Turks are not like a unified thing. You've got the aristocracy, the landed nobility, the titles, and who are sanctioned by the Caliph, but you've also got all of these tribes from Central Asia who are Turkish, and who are pagan or believe in other things and are not sort of part of the empire. They're not ruled necessarily directly, but they are loose cultural and cultural allies for the most part, sometimes religious, and they have their own agendas. And so keeping this loose confederation kind of together and angled towards the same objectives, that was one of the big challenges that the Sultan Alp Arslan faced, and that's why he was always going back to the Middle East and Central Asia to do conquest and stuff to bring those peoples under his reign. So when we think about the Seljuks versus the Byzantines, the Byzantine Empire is very easy to understand. A centralized state with a centralized political body and belief system and a centralized army, right? That's very easy for us to understand in modern terms. With the Seljuk side, it was much different. And so I've tried to, in the Levian campaign, reflect some of that political difference with the way that the Seljuks play, how they score points, even down to like individual lords, when the capabilities they can equip and sort of what they're better at versus and what their force makeup is versus some of the other ones.
It makes me think a little bit of Rome going into Gaul. Mm-hmm. Rome is monolithic, and Gaul is there's 10 different tribes of varying, and and there's no centralized authority. There's the toughest, and that's about it.
Exactly, and in that example, it would just be like the reverse. Imagine if all of those confederated, or all of those fractured Gallic tribes and stuff. Imagine a few of them started to raid down into Rome, right. and Rome had to respond, and then suddenly they started to ally with each other potentially, and so cause conflict. That's essentially what was happening.
Right, and which eventually happens later, not so much from the Gauls, but more from the
other
Germans.
Tribes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, so this is the first wargame you've designed.
It is, yeah.
Have you been a long-time wargamer? What's your wargaming history?
Yeah, I have. Well, I don't know. I'm definitely not as long wargaming as maybe some of the people at this convention or just in general. But so I started wargaming in, I would say, probably end of 2013, probably end of 2013. And that was because I watched a YouTube. I was into board games. I've been into board games my whole life, but I wasn't playing war games or any really historical games. That was a foreign concept to me. I watched a YouTube video review of Andean Abyss, which is the first coin game. And I remember thinking, through a channel I followed, and I remember thinking, what a weird topic for a board game. Who would come up with that? Why would they make that?
Volko would be so happy to hear you say that.
Yeah, I've told him this on a number of occasions about this, but there was something about that I was like, I'd really like to experience that. What's that about? I've never played a board game that's about modeling the Colombian drug war of the 90s. What a crazy niche thing. So I ended up picking up a copy after I watched a little bit about it and read about it, and it sounded really interesting. I'm a huge fan of asymmetry. I think that's why there's a lot more asymmetry in Seljuk, because I just like those games that have that design. And I loved what I played of Andean Abyss. I thought it was so interesting and so unique, and that kind of got me on the train of looking at more war games. From there, I went to other coin games like A Distant Plane, Twilight Struggle, Wilderness War. A lot of like the card-driven stuff really appealed to me. And of course, as any wargamer knows, once you get on the train, it's hard to get off, and I just took off. And so now I own way too many games, and most of them are war games. So
Yeah. So you started with the coin games, which was Volkos, and then
Yep.
meld into Levy and Campaign, which is Volkos.
Yep.
But Volkos. Did you have the idea for the game before he started the Levy and Campaign series? Was that sprung you?
It was actually a confluence of two things, which was Nevsky had just come out, and I had played it with my friend, and we were just, because it's such a different, unique game, Levy and Campaign. It really forces you to think in ways that most games don't, and it plays so differently. We played Nevsky, and hilariously, that first game of Nevsky, it was like a race to see whose army could starve first and lose.
Totally.
We didn't know what we were doing,
Yeah.
but we kept playing it. We really liked the mechanics at play, and we kept playing it. We played 4 or 5 games over the span of like, three weeks or so, and every time we played, we got further into the game, we learned the lessons about how you play well, and it just kept revealing itself as like a really deep system for gaming. So I really liked that about it. At the same time that was happening, I was listening to the history of Byzantium to and from work, and when I had downtime and stuff, and I just so happened to be listening to the episode about the Battle of Manzikert, which is a spectacular episode. It's episode 193 on the history of Byzantium. Even if you listen to nothing else, if you want to understand what Seljuk as a game is about, listen to that episode.
Great.
It's 2 hours long. He does an amazing job talking about all the political and narrative context around why what happened. But what struck me the most was his narrative telling matched up almost perfectly with the modeling mechanics that Volko had come up with for medieval campaigning, right? All of the same challenges and issues that are in the game from Nevsky or in the system were present in the narrative history. And a light bulb in my head was like, this would make such an incredible game. It's mapped almost perfectly for like what this game system is for and what actually happened. So I sent him an email shortly after that, and I was like, hey, playing Nevsky, really love it. I just wanted to let you know this would be a perfect for medieval Byzantium. If anyone's looking at designing for the system, or if you're planning on doing more games, I think you should look at the history. It's really great. And he responded to me. He's like, yeah, you should do that.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, but I've never designed a game before. He's like, you just try it. And so that kind of and then as those emails exchanges were happening, COVID started. So no one could go anywhere. No one could do anything. A lot of free time. So I said, well, I will try it. And that is kind of what got me down this road. And obviously, having played a lot of war games helps to like get a design going. And additionally, starting with an established system that has a core solid rule set that is like really good, that really helps, because as a first-time designer, when I come to events like this and I see first-time designers with games that they've come up with a whole cloth from their head, I'm like, how do you even conceive of this existing, all at once? And so having that sort of stepping stone of like something that's established that you can then build on top of was a huge boon. And I'm so grateful that Volko is so supportive of people doing that with his systems and his rule sets.
And that whole there's a Discord server that's just devoted to Levy and Campaign. Did that start up during COVID? Like, that's the way everybody kind of kept in touch?
Yeah, and I don't know that it maybe necessarily started with the intent of being a Levy and Campaign specific Discord. It was started by Paco Gradai, the guy who designed Plantagenet. So that game was the first sort of non-Volko campaign game that was in development. And so I think maybe he started the Discord to kind of like communicate with the developers or other stuff like that, maybe find fans and playtesters and stuff. I don't really quite know the history there. I do know that Seljuk I had started designing before that Discord stuff happened, and then I got linked to it, I think, through Volko. And when I joined, I noticed that they had a pretty big community for the game system. And this was probably shortly after Almoravid came out, or it was about to come out, so there was already other games on the horizon. And I noticed that there were a lot of people who had ideas, like in the same way that I did, which was, this system would be perfect for this conflict, or people had a really nice a favorite era of history, but they wanted to give game design a try, and they couldn't create it themselves. I don't know, whatever the reason was. And so people started flocking to it. Designers and whatnot, and it was very open. Like, if you wanted to invite to go, you just go, and if you wanted to propose a game project, they'd create a sub channel for you, and you could lay out what you were thinking, get feedback from people, and however far you wanted to take it, there was a space to do that. And so it's just grown over the several years to be all about, in the same way like the Coin Discord did, to be all about the system and the people who are passionate about it, and people who are passionate about history and exploring where could the system go if you take it out of the medieval period, which we've seen now with the Pipoli and Jason. So yeah, that resource has been incredible, because not only does it provide playtesters, it provides proofreaders, it provides people to bounce ideas off of, it provides instant feedback basically from people, and it also really enables global people from around the world to be interactive. So for example, the series developer Christophe Correa, who is also done the vassal modules for the existing Living campaign as their own vassal. He is the series developer now, so I'm working with him, and he lives in France, right? I never would have been able to connect with him necessarily had it not been for this Discord channel. So it's just a really great centralized resource, and I think GMT has also recognized how great it is because they just let it, it goes, and stuff that comes out of it only helps them. So
it really sort of feels like an expression of Volko's ethos.
Yeah.
He's just like, build it. I'll help you. I don't feel like you're taking anything away. I love to see. I love to see what somebody does that I didn't think of.
Yeah.
He's thrilled by that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, and he's great about supporting the designers. I know when I was designing Seljuk, I had an early prototype. I was like, would you like to play test with me just for a turn or two to see what you think? And he spent a couple hours one night with me play testing it on Tabletop Simulator, actually, which is a lot easier for me to have created a digital version than Vassal. And it's just so nice to do that. And he provided lots of feedback about the mechanics and stuff. And he's in there, chatting with folks, poking around, looking at stuff. Like he's always engaged. It's not like he's off to other things. But I think to your point, seeing something that you create flourish in the hands of others, it must be so rewarding. Right?
Yeah. He's spoken about that.
Yeah.
There's such a big community there. Have you had the need to say, hey, I'm stuck on, I've got this problem. How else did somebody solve this? Or does anybody have an idea? Or does that happen?
There's a fair bit of that, and actually, something like that actually happened with Seljuk. So in an earlier iteration of Seljuk, one of my key concerns was how do we get the players to be incentivized to make decisions that would be historically plausible without having to script rules or
you don't want any of that Iron Maiden stuff that's forces stuff,
right? And also the system Living campaign in particular really is a sandbox for all of the games, right? A lot of them you can kind of decide what you want to do, stuff historically, whatever. So that has always been front and center in my mind in terms of getting the incentive structure right so that the game would hopefully lead to a battle of Manzikert or a big battle like Manzikert at some point during the game.
Right.
And the asymmetry, it also makes it much more complex to design for. So one of the things that we ended up talking about, me and Christoph, the developer, when we were doing early playtesting, I think even before he was assigned as the developer, it may have been right afterwards, was the Ravage mechanic, and talking about other games in the series. Sometimes people felt that you could just march past each other and ravage each other's territories, and it's whoever did that better would get more victory points and win, right? And ravaging is such a key part of the Seljuk campaigns against the Byzantines in particular. That was mostly what they were doing. There was a lot less open battle unless the Romans were forcing it. So I wanted to make sure that Ravage was an important mechanic. And Christoph actually, we were looking at it and being well, it doesn't quite feel right. What is the incentive structure for the Seljuks to not ravage, right? Or to ravage in ahistorical ways, or for the Roman player to just ignore it and go ravage himself. And what we came up with was actually tied into one of the other features of the game, which is the themata. And Christoph had this idea. He said, well, what if when you ravage as the Seljuks, there's a chance that you could block the ravage? What if these units, these provincial units that are localized in these geographic areas, what if they could sort of counter patrol the ravaging armies? And so that created that kind of spurred a discussion between us, and I did a few iterations of design, and we ended up with the ravage system that we have now, which is the Roman player ravages is like any other Levian campaign faction. You'd spend the command, you put the ravage marker down, you score. When the Seljuks ravage, they have a choice. They can spend 2 commands to ravage, and that automatically succeeds. They put it down. But if they only spend 1 command to ravage, then the Roman player, if they have available themata units on the map in these provinces, can try and defend.
So these units are actually on the map,
they are
sort of like garrison or
exactly.
Provincial. Yeah,
exactly. So and they can prevent the ravage if they roll well enough. And what they're risking to do that is that if they fail the roll, the unit's eliminated. So you get this...
They have a limited amount then.
Exactly. There's a finite amount of them. And you also get a really nice decision space for the players because each side has a choice to make about what they're doing. The Seljuk player can slow down and guarantee the ravage, but then they're not getting as much as they need. And the Roman player can risk or not their units to stop the ravage if they want. And so it makes the Ravage system much more interactive, and there's much more conflict around it. And so it's not just the battles that are in conflict, right? And so it feels really, really good. And Christoph was the one who had the seed for that idea. And we play tested a couple different ways to work that out and do it. And so, the other play testers in the Discord server, then we showed them that version, and they really liked it. They thought it was a really cool mechanic to make ravaging as more interactive between the players. And so, the Discord community has been super thoughtful and contributed a lot in the feedback of the game.
And that, what you just described, how you took like a core mechanic but twisted it, that's the key to what makes the system interesting for Volko. he doesn't want just a reskin. He's like, you've got to find new mechanics or changes to mechanics that somehow express what your particular setting is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think GMT is of the same mind as well, right? No one wants to be making and selling the same game reskinned as something else, right? What are you contributing? How are you evolving? I think Plantagenet is a great example of this because so Seljuk is based more on the core system as you would have seen in Nevsky, Almoravid, and Inferno in a lot of ways, because that's when it was started to be designed as those were kind of being finished. Paco took Plantagenet in a bunch of different directions, and such that game plays so differently, and that is probably by necessity to reflect the War of the Roses, right? There is no sieging.
No sieging.
No sieging, right? And sieging is a huge part of medieval combat. So, I think that that's the real challenge for a new designer. If you're coming in and you want to make a new game in the system, what are you bringing to the table that hasn't been seen before? How are you evolving or building on existing mechanics to give someone a new experience, right? Because you don't want to have the same rule book and mechanics in the game and someone just, it doesn't,
Well, in the case of Levy and Campaign, that's for sure, or the case of Coin, because that's Volko's. I did a whole interview with him where we just talked about series games, the history of series games, and what is a series games? It's not simply the ones that have a series rule book and exclusive. Volko's got these series where each game has its own rule book, because, as he said, he doesn't want the next game to feel bound by the last game. He wants it to take it somewhere else, and there'd be too many changes.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And if you look at, especially with Coin, for example, if you go back and play Andean Abyss now, if you've played a lot of the Coin games, it feels so distilled and pure in terms of its vision and scope, and you almost feel like you're missing some stuff, versus especially if you've played like Liberty or Death or Pendragon, or even some of the later games like the 3-player, Colonial Twilight is 2-player, and like People Power or Vijayanagara, right? The original version of that system is so distilled from where people have taken it, and now you've got stuff like Red Dust Rebellion and the Echoes. I think it's called Echoes, right? Or
I think that's the
Echoes, which are very. I don't want to say loosely, but they're based on Coin, but they take it in such a different direction, and it's...
Well, and, Volko originally thought of the, Andean Abyss was like, it's 4 players. This is how, this really cool deck mechanism where... He could not. In his mind, he couldn't have imagined the 2-player Colonial Twilight versions, and yet when Brian Train showed it to him, it was like, oh, it works, and it was like, and it blew his mind. And so that's that thing about like, put this down, change it, see what you do, and something really surprising happens.
Absolutely, and I actually think with Levy and Campaign, the thing maybe I like most about the series is that because the first volume was on such a niche, unknown topic, that has kind of set a precedent for future games to tackle things that other war games would not tackle. So Volko, when he talks about this sometimes, when he had started concepting the system, his idea was there'd be 4 games, each one in one of the 4 corners of Europe. Northeast, you've got Nevsky, Almoravid, you've got Southwest. He thought about doing one for Scotland and England, which may or may not ever happen, and Inferno for the Southeast. Is that right? Southeast, yeah. And that was just the idea. Like 4 corners of Europe, you have this about the medieval period, but then other people came along with these ideas, like Zizka, for example, the Hussite Bohemians. How many games about that topic are there? Probably you can count them on one hand throughout history, right? For me, it was like, well, this is a perfect opportunity to try my hand at something that likely would not find a home anywhere simply because of the subject matter, even if it was a traditional Hex Encounter war game, for example. But because Levy and Campaign kind of blazed the trail with some of these interesting topics, there's potentially a space for it to be found there, right? So I think you're seeing a lot of excitement around it as well from other designers, because they're probably very big fans of specific areas of history that they can't find in gaming, and so this provides an outlet for that.
It definitely feels like that system. I mean, you're bound in terms of time. It's kind of a medieval thing, but it does feel like part of the thing is like we want you to dig something out of history that isn't, other than real history nerds, nobody's going to know about this.
Yeah, exactly. And also being at the operational scale is a much different thing. So Great Battles of History, all very tactical, and like you're replaying a single battle, right? But there's no context around like why the battle is happening, why it's happening at this location, why one side or the other might want to attack or retreat, right? It's all very like vacuum sealed inside of
it's like
battle.
here's this line, here's that line, they smash together and we see what happens.
Exactly, but then when you look at Levy and Campaign games, a lot of the games really build in the political dynamics around why these campaigns are happening, and that's something that I also really appreciate, because at an operational level, there's very few games operationally that take place in the medieval period as well, because it is such a difficult it's difficult to have medieval operations. But if you look at the challenges they face, those challenges have been around since the beginning of military campaigning began, and that's why I think you're able to see the system stretch to things like Epipolae, which is the ancient Greek world, because the core fundamentals of military campaigning, no matter what the technology changes, are still the same. It's just how you go about solving them, right?
Well, and it's interesting too that these battles, operational in scale, but have a real political dimension. Whereas, if you think of any of the World War II operational games, we keep politics out of that. It's sort of like politics is something for the strategic level, and that's it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I hadn't thought about, because that was my thinking. This is my old man thinking. But it's true that politics is integral to the Levian campaign games.
Exactly. Yeah, and for whatever reason, very few operational games tackle the political side of it, which I think is so important, especially. If you're just a fan of war games because you want to play a game that's like based about something in history, I think maybe there's less of a need for it. But I think for people who really like history and want to understand history better through their play, which I know I count myself as one of those people, and why I gravitate towards topics that aren't usually covered, which is why I don't play a lot of World War II games, because it's a ground that's very familiar and the history is very accessible. I find that I get more out of playing games about topics that aren't explored a lot, because I learn about the history. Yeah, exactly. So, as I think war games get more sophisticated and we have more designers coming in and share that opinion of wanting to understand the political wrapper around what's going on, I think we're starting to see more games either be straight political in nature and abstract the conflict side, or when there is a conflict focus of the design, the political side of it is a very necessary.
I've been thinking about that a lot. So it's kind of been in the zeitgeist the last couple of years as more young people have come into the hobby and are interested in that. And I finally boiled it down to, I think there's a couple of different kinds of gamers. And a gamer, you're the type of person who wants to know why something happened. And there's a lot of those old hex and counter guys that just want to see what happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. And and they're not like, they go, yes, I've read the history books, I know the why. Just let me see the kinetic what.
Exactly. I want to play the knowledge I have of like a particular artillery battery type and its effect on the battlefield.
Yeah, I've read the history. I know why we got to how it started. So let's do it. But there's a lot of people who want to feel like the why is there, and even even the why is like, why did Gettysburg happen at Gettysburg?
Exactly.
That's a totally valid question.
Yeah, and anytime, and that's a really good point, because anytime I see people playing like Road to Gettysburg, GCACW, frequently the big battles they have don't happen in Gettysburg, right? And because once you start putting inflection points in, you get almost an infinite number of possibilities, and so. I think the counterfactual history is actually a very valuable thing about games. And I know some people don't like it when you can have counterfactuals happen, but I actually think that counterfactuals really illustrate why the factuals existed sometimes. And in Seljuk in particular, like I said, going back to what I was talking about, where I'm trying to incentivize players to really want to have one big battle at the end to really decide the game, there's a reason that happened. And so if you can create the right incentive structure without telling people you must do this, players get the experience of the commander or of the political entity that is like responsible for this conflict, and I think that's so much more valuable than just being forced to have one specific action that you do.
If you're playing a war game, as soon as you make the first move, you're into counterfactual or alternate history, whatever. Unless it's completely scripted, in which case
it's not a game.
It's not a game. I have a few games like that where I just go, this is more like reading a book. I'm not really doing anything.
Yeah.
The moves are so, even if I'm not told what to do, the moves are so obvious that you can only do the historical, and it's
exactly.
That's not a game.
And also, like, the best narrative, like, one of the reasons I play games is like the narrative, right? Like, you always remember those moments where you needed to roll a 6 and you rolled a 6, or those moments where you had to like one lone defender hold off against the horde. Like, that's the kind of stuff that you talk about way afterwards, and you may not remember the specifics of the game, but you remember that moment. And when it's player driven, when those moments happen because of emergent player decision making and abilities to make those decisions and have those things happen, that to me is what makes a game great, versus just being a game that you play for whatever other reason. And so that I can speak personally is that when I started Seljuk, I wanted to make sure that the counterfactuals were plausible, so they weren't outside the realm. They weren't things that would just never have happened because of the political nature of the political context of what's happening. But the players do have a decision to drive the strategy and the decision making of the historical person in a different way if they want to explore what may have been possible to happen, and I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, and yeah, me too. And as long as we can go down the counterfactual, or if we take the road of the historical has to be possible, or it's out. But it just has to be one of many possibilities.
Yes.
Because also sometimes the historical was kind of the outlier. It's what shouldn't have happened.
Exactly. How many times do you run the simulation on the German invasion of France and Germany doesn't actually win, for example, in 1940, right? That particular thing we're talking about is probably one of the hardest things to do in designing a game, because you can't take into account all player behavior all the time. Like, for example, here, even just at this convention, I did several demos of Seljuk, and I saw players make decisions that I've never seen them make before, and none of them were wrong. They were all, for their situation, the right decision. But getting that balance right, getting it so that the sandbox you've created doesn't get so far outside the bounds of history that you've actually not created a believable model, and then it's just purely a fantasy game versus being scripted, is a balancing act that I think is so difficult to achieve. And as I started to design this game and worked on design, I can see it in other games more, where it's like, whoa, if they had made X decision to do this rule instead of this rule, you would not have had that kind of sort of channel that you can explore but still takes you down towards what the historical results were. And so anytime I see a designer able to accomplish that in a game, I sort of have firsthand appreciation for that, because it's really a feel thing. I mean, there are systemic and mathematical things that you can do to achieve that, but it is really a feel thing, because everyone plays a game and feels differently about it. So to get a majority of players to feel like their decisions matter, but also that they're not going off the rails of history, is the secret sauce of wargaming, in my opinion.
I think so too, and I think something you said earlier about the feeling you get, the things we remember about that. Well, so you got to roll a 6, whatever. If the game just kind of takes you to the place where you have to roll a 6, it's not as exciting as you feel like I built up this whole situation where. Yeah. Because of everything I did, I needed a 6. If I'd done worse, I would have needed an 8 or whatever. You go. So I did all this stuff. I got there and I got it. That feels good.
Yeah, you want meaningful consequences for your actions. In games, and that's why they're so magical to me.
Yeah, me too. Well, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, since you're a first-time designer, is so we've talked a lot about the game, but. How did you pitch it to GMT, or how did that come? Because I think a lot of people that want to design games, they're like, well, how do I get my foot in the door? Yeah. They don't realize that it's not that the door is not incredibly closed.
Right. No, and in fact, I would actually say the opposite. I'd say the door is incredibly open. Yeah. Especially when you come to an event like SD HistCon. I'd say the number one way, if someone's looking to design a game and wants to get it in front of people, is to come to events like this. There are so many designers and publishers here who are so willing to look and play, even just for a little bit, stuff that people bring. I have seen so many prototypes this year for people who are first-time designers at this convention specifically, and I'm sure it's happening at other conventions around the country as well. And if you just keep showing up at those things, eventually someone will take notice if you've got a good design, or if you don't, you'll get feedback from the people who are responsible for good designs, and you just keep working at it. So that, I think, is the main one. I don't think there's very few people, at least that I've met in the wargaming space, from both the publishing side and the designing side, that are closed off and don't want people to succeed. It feels very collaborative and very supportive, in the sense that people want to see cool games, and if you have cool ideas, people want to check them out, and if they think there's problems, they'll give feedback. And so as long as you approach showing your game with an air and openness to receive critical feedback, then I think you will find a home at some point, because there are so many publishers now than there were even 10 years ago when I started wargaming, and even before that. But coming back to your question about how I pitched it to GMT, it was actually that method. So obviously Volko knew I was working on it, and I made sure that he play tested it with me to see if it was something that would stand up to what the requirements for the series were. But once he played it and liked it, and he was on board, he really did advocate and helped. And I told him, hey, I'm gonna go to GMT weekend at the warehouse. Would it be weird if I brought this prototype? Because there's no guarantee that they'd want it. There's no guarantee the series would have gone to, it's gonna be volume 5 volumes, And he's like, yeah, you should take it. He's like, I'll just let Gene know that you're gonna be there. You should meet with him. So I took it to GMT weekend at the warehouse, and I sat down, and Gene made some time because Volko told him I'd be there, and he did that with every prototype that was there. By the way, he made some time to take a look at it, but also to get to know me, and that's much more GMT's motto: is they want to know the people they're working with. That's way more important to them than the game, and then if they have a good game, that's great. So it was great. So I sat down with Gene for like an hour, and we just talked about our personal lives and our backgrounds and how they do business, and where I come from and stuff like that, and very, very little actually about the game. And part of that, I think, is because GMT trusts Volko.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. But that was helpful, and then I showed up at GMT weekend at the warehouse again after that, and I believe I went a third time and just kept bringing the prototype back with the revisions and the playtesting. I got people, even if I only got one playtest in an entire weekend, it was still worthwhile. People kept seeing it, right? I was active on social media with it. And just over time, it slowly became real because I just kept showing up and kept at it. So I think that if you're really passionate about a game design that you have and you want to get it out there, you just have to keep showing up. And
right, yeah. You're quite right about it. Like at this convention, for sure, that's a thing. There's tons of people here with prototypes. And I've seen like designers and publishers. Like there's a 13 or 14-year-old young fella here with a design, and like Steve Carey's just over there going, hey, can I play that with you?
Yeah.
It's just like,
yeah.
And so even if you don't have the in of vocal in the GMT, like everybody here is interested.
Yeah. Just get into the space.
Yeah.
Get into the space,
Yeah.
whether it's you're creating content or you're being social or you are playtesting other people's games. The best way, actually, and this has been a theme of conversations I've had around the convention this weekend, is, they say if you want to become a better writer, read a lot. It's the same with game design. Play lots and lots of different games. Play prototypes. Play good ones. Play bad ones. And those will all inform your decision making when it comes to designing stuff and give you ideas and mechanics and other things that you want to try and encapsulate with your design. And that will also help. So you don't even necessarily need direct feedback, but playing a lot of games helps, And even if your convention doesn't have any designers at it, it's just a gaming convention, still go. Get people to play it, get people to take a look at it. You never know who show up, and also the more. So my philosophy when I started Seljuk was, even if it doesn't become a real project, even if it is something that GMT passes on and no one wants to publish, I at least have still made a physical prototype that is playable, that is a game about something I want to play about. And
right.
If that is all that it becomes, that's good enough for me. So I think if you have that kind of attitude as well, no matter whether it's published or not, if you've created something in the world that other people can experience, like, that's still not nothing. You know what I mean?
Well, two things about that. One is I find with a lot of designers, they kind of... before they don't always manage to pitch or sell their first design,
Yeah.
but they kind of get hooked on design too, and so they've got 5 different things kind of on the burner, and then one sticks. So like I've talked to lots of designers on the podcast, and that's been a familiar story. But the other one, going back to something else you said about like keep playing games, I've noticed in my interviews with designers that the top designers, like the guys that you think have got it in the bag, they just, they could design in their sleep. Those are the guys that say, I'm always playing new games.
Yep.
I'm just like guys like John Butterfield, Voco, Mark Herman, like those guys, they never quit playing games.
I had that exact conversation with Cole Wehrle the first night that we were here. And obviously he's such an interesting guy, and the way he thinks about games is so captivating, and like his thought process behind stuff. And he and I actually share a lot of the same tastes about specific games. So we're both big fans of the Library of Napoleonic Battles and stuff, so we talk about that a lot. But yeah, just even getting their perspective on new games that they've played. So one of the fun conversations I had with Cole was, what new game have you played that you really liked? What new game have you played that you really liked? Or what game have you played recently that you hated? So we had a whole conversation about Tanto Manta yesterday, or a couple nights ago, and whether we liked it or not, and what we liked about it, or what we didn't like about it, and stuff like that. And it was really interesting to get his perspective about specifically what he didn't like, or what he did like. And how that relates to me. And then I look at his game designs and I see, his perspective about this particular philosophy of a designed game that we've both played shows up in his designs. What can you learn from a designer's problem solving, right? Even if they tell you about something that's they struggled with, that was very difficult for them. I was talking to him about the way that Oath, the new expansion that they're doing that kind of changes the game, how that came to be and how they approached adding more content to Oath, which ostensibly, quote unquote, was a finished product. And that was just such an interesting, fascinating conversation to understand how he approaches design and how that expresses itself in the games of his that I've played. John Company, Arcs, right? The genius behind those games and where that comes from, and why he would make a certain choice about that stuff versus how I would do it, and maybe in the future I wouldn't make that choice because I see how his perspective is correct. Even that is just very helpful, and like even if you don't have a game that you want to design, or you're designing something currently, like having those conversations might kickstart you into, I want to try this.
And sometimes it's not the whole game. Sometimes there's just like the game as a whole, B plus, A minus, whatever. But it had this mechanic that just intrigued me, and and it made me think, wouldn't it work great for that situation?
Yeah, that's actually coming back to Seljuk real quick. That's actually one of the genesis points of Seljuk was playing Nevsky. There's one capability or maybe two in that game for the Rus player, which is the Kipchak and Mongol Asiatic horse. So there's just like a couple of these Asiatic horse units who are not armored whatsoever, but they have bows and they can like evade melee combat, right? And they're, you may or may not have them in your game of Nevsky, but they're just like this weird oddity in the force pool makeup of that game. And I thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if there was a whole game based around the idea that one side was predominantly like this very fast, mobile, lightly armored horse archer, and the other side was like this slow, lumbering, armored, European army, basically. And that also kind of got me thinking, among the other confluence of factors when I started designing Seljuk, and I just kind of wanted to take that thought to the extreme. And we kind of did that in Seljuk. I mean, most of the Seljuk lords have mostly Turkic horse, and they are mostly glass cannons. They have really strong archery, but if you can, as the Roman player, stand in against that archery and survive, your melee punchback and your armored units will absolutely devastate them. Right. So there's a really nice little cat and mouse of like, what capabilities do you have that I'm then going to counter capability? Do I want to attack you or always evade? Who's a defender in a battle? There's a lot of really interesting asymmetric force pool stuff there. And that all came from looking at a game and being like, this is really fascinating, this mechanic. Is there a basis of a whole game or even part of a game around it? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, to get closer to wrapping up, then, where are we with Seljuk in terms of like when are people going to see it? It's long past its P500.
Yes.
It's made that. Is all that. So it's past. Are you final art? Have you done that? Is that all done? Or
yeah, we're closing on the very end. I more than anyone else, I think, even the people awaiting it to go to production, want it to be out there. I've been working on it since 2020, so it's been a long time. We're at the very end. A couple days before coming to San Diego, I got the first final rules layout art from GMT. So me and Christoph are proofing that right now. We're doing the final proofing of the first draft of the playbook. And those are really the two major tasks left to be done. We have a few corrections we need to make on some of the stuff, but all the final art for the cards, the map, the player aids, and the box is all done. So that's all ready to go, and the counters all done, all ready to go. So we're just in that very laborious end phase where you want to make sure all the documentation is correct, it matches, there's no errata. Christoph is very, very good at catching misalignments between different documents, and so we're just taking a fine-tooth comb through all of this stuff. So I sat 2 days ago or 3 days ago, I sat at my computer for 3 hours and I read the Seljuk rulebook front to back, top to bottom, to make sure I was catching stuff, and then we're going to do another round, send back the corrections to GMT. They're going to send us back. So it's really just a back and forth proofing at this point. And
it's got to be the most awful part of the whole process in many ways.
It is certainly the least fun.
Yeah.
And I knew when I started, I'm like, if this ever becomes a real game, I'm going to get to this point and it's going to suck.
Yeah.
And here we are. And it is the most tedious. It is very laborious, so it takes a lot of man hours to do it. But it is also the most important for the end consumer because it needs to be all tight and correct. We want as few errata and clarifications as we can possibly have. And so we're aiming for that. I think it's almost impossible to catch it all, especially with how complex the Levian campaign system is, but we're trying. And so, once that's all done, my personal goal is to have all that done before Christmas so that we can send say GMT, we are done with this, and then they can take it for the production step, and that will be based on their pipeline and stuff like that. So that's my goal. And we'll see how that goes. But I'm fairly confident at this point that it'll be
out in 2025.
Yeah, 2025, hopefully first half of the year.
Yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you and great getting the perspective of a first-time designer.
Thanks
that's
so much for
fantastic.
having me, Grant. It's really awesome.
Well, great. Enjoy the rest of the convention.
Yeah, you too.
As you can tell, Justin is also a great fan of games and has a sharp eye for tactics and balance. Be careful if you play them. Okay, time to talk about a game. Espana, 1936. Despite its fascinating history, before this I only had a single game on the Spanish Civil War, and it isn't even a game on the entire conflict, but rather on a single campaign, The Fall of Madrid, published by the much-missed Battles magazine. So when De Beer Games offered to let me try their new edition of Espana 1936, I jumped at the chance. The original game was published in Spanish in 2007 and then in English in 2008. As well, there was a small expansion in 2008, La Armada, which added naval units to the original design. I think this may have been included in the English version of the game and just as an expansion for the Spanish edition. I'm not sure about that, but in any case, this new 2024 version includes it, no expansion needed. In his notes, designer Antonio Catalan says there are no substantial changes to the rules as the game was working very well already. There is the addition of the La Armada units, as well as a few optional cards that can be swapped in. And as well, there are 2 scenarios, one that covers the whole war, 1936 to 1939, and another shorter one that starts in 1938. The biggest change is in the look of the package. All the artwork has been redone. The cards, the map, the counters, even the box cover. All brand new, very different from the previous edition, but still retain a flavor of 1930s propaganda art. I really love that style. The mounted map is point to point, all of Spain, with 34 points representing either cities or regions. Once you start playing, you notice that not all points that look adjacent to each other actually are connected. In many cases, you'll have to move east-west before you can move north and vice versa. Each of these 34 points or territories is divided into 2 halves, with a space for nationalists on the left and republicans on the right, which feels a bit weird as it's exactly opposite of their left-right political ideologies. Anyway, as well, the spaces are outlined in black or white, with the black ones being important objective cities or territories. The counters are very large, at least an inch, and fairly simple. They have a numerical value of mostly for 1 to 3, but a few 5s to indicate unit strength. And then some will also have a smaller DRM across from the strength number. This DRM is used in combat. And finally, there's a small insignia on some to indicate a special unit affiliation. The Communists, Army of Africa, International Brigade, things like that. The Republicans are red, the Nationalists are blue, but there's also green nationalist counters for African troops, the Spanish Legion, and Italian volunteers. Finally, there are counters for air units, tanks, and generals. The air and tank counters aren't units precisely, but more like assets that can be added to a battle. And then finally, there are cards. Each side has its own deck, and further, those decks are split in 2 with a 36-37 half and a 38-39 half. Setup is easy. De Veer has obviously aimed this game at an audience a bit wider than strictly a wargaming crowd. Its rulebook looks a bit like a Eurogame rulebook, more that than a war game, which is pretty good, actually. When the game is this straightforward, I think it's a good idea to have those Euro-style rulebooks. In this particular case, that means there are 3 pages early on that tell you where to place each counter and marker, along with a map illustration showing you where everything goes. It's very straightforward. I should also note that there is a hard-mounted battle board for combat, and each player has a small hard-mounted player mat to keep their generals, planes, and replacement points on. Gameplay is fairly simple, as you might expect. 6 phases, with some having very little to do. First phase is the card draw. You draw 6 cards at the beginning of the game and at the beginning of the 1938 scenario when the decks switch, 1938 year when the decks switch, and then 3 cards on all the other turns. A full game is 10 turns long. Then next is movement. The Nationalist moves first, then the Republican. At first I thought this might be a back and forth, unit by unit sort of movement, but no. The Nationalist moves all their pieces, then the Republican moves all theirs. I imagine this order reflects how the Nationalists dictated much of the direction of the conflict, while the Republicans were more often on the defensive and reactive. When moving, if a unit starts in a territory free of enemies, it can move anywhere on the board as long as it follows the point-to-point connectors and as long as it doesn't enter a territory with an enemy unit in it. Once it enters such a territory, it has to stop. Pieces that start in a territory that is already contested by an enemy have much less freedom. They can leave the contested space and move to an adjacent space. That's it. But there's a couple large caveats. The space moved into must contain a friendly unit, and you cannot move out the last remaining friendly unit from a contested area. That is, you cannot abandon an area completely to the enemy. Got to fight it out. Tanks move much the same way, but they're not constricted when leaving a contested space to only moving a single space. They can move as far as you wish, but only through friendly spaces. They can't enter an enemy empty territory or an occupied enemy territory. They can only enter such a space if a friendly combat unit is already there. Airplanes are assigned from the player's player mat to wherever the player wants to beef up their forces. Airplanes are moved after all the combat units and tanks have moved. Then it's time to assign the generals. Each side has a small number of these men to begin the game with, just 3 or 4. Again, starting with the Nationalist, players alternate placing their generals, but this is a 1-by-1 placement rather than one side places all, then the other. This placement is important as the only places where battles will actually be fought in a turn are spaces with a general or generals. There's a bit of cat and mouse revealed here, as there will often be many more contested spaces on the board than generals available, so you can keep your opponent guessing as to where the fights are really going to take place. After the generals are placed, it's the combat phase. Again, this is a back and forth alternating phase. The nationalist player selects one of their generals and declares whether they will fight in that space or not. If they do, the battle is resolved. If they decline battle, nothing happens, but either way, the general token is flipped to show that it has been used. Then it's the Republican players to choose a general, and so on. Combat is very straightforward. The attacker chooses one of its units as the attacking unit, and which defending unit is attacking. Both sides can commit support units, tanks and air, as well as cards from their hand which give modifiers for attack and defense. The unit's strength number, 1 to 5, tells you how many dice to roll. Any air you've added give you extra dice, while any tanks and cards you've added will give you dice roll modifiers. Each side rolls, and 5s and 6s are hits. Losses are taken by these lead units. A 3 strength unit that takes 2 hits becomes a 1 strength unit. I guess I should mention also that there are these 5 strength units in the game, and 1 hit reduces them straight to a 3. There's no 4s. Like many step loss games, the counters are generally flipped to take a single loss. 5s are flipped to 3s, 2s are flipped to 1s. 3s, however, need to be replaced by 2s, and there's a small wrinkle here. If there's no suitable counter available in the off-board counter mix, you have to replace it with a lesser unit. That is, a line unit may get replaced by a militia unit, things like that. After the combat phase, it's the event phase. This is the other phase cards can be used. As well as the combat modifiers, each card has an event. So it's that common choice where a player has to choose between the event or the modifiers. And then finally, there's a maintenance phase where both players retrieve their air units and generals from the board, checks their hand to make sure they don't have too many or too few cards, and calculates the replacement points. These can be used to upgrade degraded units. And then it's on to the next turn. Victory is determined by control of the black territory spaces. If you manage to control 8 at the end of the turn, you win and game ends. There's also a few other automatic victory conditions, such as the nationalist winning immediately if they control Madrid by turn 3. But if none of these conditions are met by the end of the game, the calculator for replacement points is made again, and the side with the most replacement points is the winner, just by a whisker. There's quite a few variant and optional rules provided as well, some granting it a bit more chrome, some dealing with what-if situations, and some forcing a more strictly historical playing. I've only played the main game and have yet to try the Armada rules, but that felt like quite enough. I didn't feel like the main game was lacking in any sense, and I don't think adding optional rules was going to complete the game in any way. It was just going to add more things to it. The nationalists definitely have the stronger forces and are on the offensive more often. To balance this, the Republicans get to move second, and so they get to react. As well, the Republican has a card that allows them a free offensive one turn that happens before the nationalist even gets to move. So it's not all defense for the Republicans all the time. The cards are the spice of the game. They grant upgrades to units, or they can add new units. They can call for the withdrawal of an enemy unit. They can give a special advantage that lasts through the whole turn. And then they're also, like so many CDGs, where most of the history is tucked in the history text. In terms of gameplay, I imagine players who have played many times will begin to know the decks and know which cards to look out for and fear. I got to say, it's rare for me to play a game often enough to learn the deck. Even if I play it multiple times, it's usually not back to back to back to back. So the cards were fun and always a surprise when I was playing. The other big part is the placement of the generals. It's possible to induce your opponent into playing a general in a defensive position because they don't know where your next general will be played and they have no more generals to place. The nationalists can also make the Republicans build up forces in non-vital areas just due to the threat of a general being placed there. All of this felt fairly thematic. No army can attack everywhere at once, but you don't always know where the attack will be. Once the sequence of play is understood, the game moves very smoothly. For smaller battles, there's no need to move the pieces to the battle board even. And once we had the hang of it, we didn't even use the battle board for the large battles, unless we really needed the room to spread out the counters. The game, at least in our playings, becomes quite attritional. The replacement points you get at the end of turns don't come close to covering the losses incurred. Cards can bring you some replacements, but still, you're going to attrit away. Of course, there's always the possibility that we fought too often when we should have spent more time maneuvering. It's easy to fall into the trap of just slugging it out when you're playing a new game. The Republicans feel harder to play, at least initially. I'm not suggesting the game is unbalanced, just with the Republican, you have to find ways to put the nationalist on the back foot every once in a while, or you're going to get steamrolled. And I'm guessing that if you do get into a straight slugfest, the nationalist is going to win more often than not. That said, we didn't feel like it was a drag to play the Republicans at all. After all, who doesn't want to defeat Franco? There is a vassal module for the game, but it's based on the original version, so it has the old artwork. Here's hoping Devere or a fan updates it to the newest graphics. Okay, interview number 2, Maurice Suckling. Maurice is a designer with a few games out. In my collection, I have his Freeman's Farm game from Worthington, as well as his new Operation Barclay from Salt and Pepper. But as well as being a designer, Maurice is also a student of ludology and a professor of the same. For a course on game design and theory that he teaches, he couldn't find a textbook that exactly fit what he wanted to discuss in his class, so he wrote his own. Paper Time Machines was published earlier this year, and I heartily recommend it. And not just for designers, but for anyone interested in the history of war games and taking apart the different tools in a designer's toolbox. As a designer, Maurice is on the leading edge of looking for ways to design games where the mechanics reinforce the theme or action of the game. Here's our discussion.
Hello from San Diego. I'm here with Maurice Suckling. How are you doing, Maurice?
I'm quite well, thank you.
I'm delighted to get to talk to you today, not least because I just finished reading your new book, Paper Time Machines, which I loved. But also, it was we got the lovely chance to play a game together yesterday, and that was pretty fun as well. We were both losers at Virgin Queen.
Everyone was a winner, Grant. We all won.
that may well be. For anybody, for people who don't know, you've got your design credits are things like Freeman's Farm and Chancellorsville with Worthington, Operation Barclay. Do you have another game with Salt and Pepper?
Yeah, no. So almost everything I've done so far has been published through Worthington, Freeman's Farm, as you said, and Chancellorsville, 1863. I also did a game called Hidden Strike, American Revolution with them, and a game on the Siege of Malta, 1565.
Right, yes.
And also, most recently, Crisis 1914. And then with Salt and Pepper games, Operation Barclay has just come out.
Is the only one, yeah. I don't know why I thought Crisis 1914 was a Salt and Pepper game for some reason. Just because I haven't played.
Right.
I was hoping to play it this weekend, but I haven't managed it yet. Well, let's get to the games later. Let's talk about your book first, because it's kind of fresh in my mind. The book is Paper Time Machines, and it seems like you kind of do 3 things in the book where you talk about what war games are, what their components are in a way, how they're made, and then a section on how to make one if you're a first-time designer. And the other section was you've got a lovely section on the history of wargaming, which was like that's kind of a pet interest of mine. I think it's like lots of people my age, and it was like, oh, there's a couple of things in there that I didn't know. I loved reading that section for sure. What was you're an academic,
Right.
So, and the first part of the book particularly reads very much like an academic book. You're very scrupulous about crediting where you got every piece of information. So it feels like that. But what was the impetus of writing this book?
So I wanted to put a course together for students, I actually targeted at graduate students, at master's and doctoral students on historical simulation board games. So that was the impetus. And as I started looking around, there was a lot of disparate information, and I realized that I just didn't see it very likely that my students were going to do the sort of expanse of reading across the different sources that I had in mind, or I was thinking, well, I'm going to end up doing a lot of collating work to try and put things together in a coherent way for people who maybe might have no understanding of this world at all. So then I realized, well, I'm probably far more likely to be successful in my intentions with that course, to kind of introduce the topic and get people designing their own games if I put something together that would be a single volume that I could say, okay, that's basically the blueprint for the course. So as I started thinking about that, it became clear to me that I really needed to be thinking in those kind of verified ways that you talk about. So really there's 5 sections, 5 parts to the book, and one is context. So before we kind of talk about how do you make these games, I wanted my students to understand, well, where have they come from and what exists already? And part of that context is not just about the history of the hobby, but it's also about, well, what do we even mean by simulations? What does that, it's very easy to use those words, but it's harder to kind of be more defined about that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's a fraught rabbit hole talking about what's a simulation, what's a model, what's a war game is like.
Right.
It is a sinkhole. But
and I wanted my students to at least grapple with it and to understand that, well, maybe there weren't easy answers, but they needed to contextualize the work that they were going to do. And that's also part of that is thinking about, well, what do we mean by critical design and ways of sort of getting people to be more self-conscious about, a game is not just a game. A game is always a piece of culturally and historically contextualized. It's an argument whether you mean it to be or not.
it's a piece of art, whether you mean it to be or not. And it's an argument.
It's saying something.
It's just like a novel has
Right.
got a point of view.
Right.
But you think you're just telling a story, but there's more than that.
Yeah, and what is even just a story. So I wanted my students to embrace that, and then just to kind of run through briefly the other 5 parts. So first part is the context. The second part is, well, what are the basic tools and processes that are involved in the making of these sorts of games. And then the third section is looking more explicitly at what I call war games, games that are really interested in modeling, simulating military operations. And then the fourth section is a series of case studies that looks at games that I don't really think of as being war games, but they're what I call historical board games. They're interested in modeling other aspects of history that aren't expressly to do with military operations. And then the fifth part is looking at some of the selected topics that we are likely to interact with when we think about board games in a critical way, ways of thinking about games as contributors to an argument about post-colonialism, for example.
Yeah, but a very topic that's been at the top of people's mind for a couple of years now.
Right, and so that section. I suppose I could have written a book about that whole section, but that wouldn't have really helped people from a practitioner's perspective. So I wanted to get my students over the line there and help them. The idea is that they're going to make their own games.
Right. Yeah. And and to go back when you were talking about an earlier section when you're trying to, in a way define. I appreciated that section. You tiptoed through it, but you did come down with a point of view of what a war game is to you, and even if that doesn't resonate with somebody else, it's like I think everybody kind of has like, well, this is where the edges of my thinking are. As blurry as it might be, but everybody's got some edges on that, and yeah, that's good. You don't back away from it. One of the things you talked about there was, or in the book that when you talked about what it goes in and what stays out, what makes something purely a war game or not, and politics is a big thing. We're seeing more and more political games, or we're seeing war games with political aspects. And I always think of politics are really easy to put in a game that's at the strategic level, where we're talking about country, and the farther down you go, it feels like they're harder to put in, or they feel shoehorned in. But I was talking to Justin Fassino today, and he mentioned how the Levian campaign game is really at the operational level, but those games they're filled with politics. Yeah. So that shook my thinking quite a bit. You like to see politics represented in the games. I think that's got to be your point of view.
Yeah. Well, I suppose just backing up a moment from there, I would say that a game that expresses no view in politics is still a game that's expressing a view in politics.
Right.
So the lack of politics is still a political perspective. And for various reasons in our hobby, those strategic and operational level games that we saw in the 70s and the 80s often excluded that political dimension, which, like I said, is still a way of expressing something. It's sort of expressing a kind of, if you like, it's sort of a purist military perspective, which is that, hey, we could manage this war much better if politicians just stay out of the way. This is how the war could have been conducted. I guess, I suppose in my mind, as I say that, I'm thinking about strategic level World War II games that purport to put you in the shoes of key historical actors who are making key strategic decisions. My point of view is that if that game is ignoring the fact that Roosevelt has an election to win midway through the war, or might even have some difficulty beginning to prosecute the war if Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, that has, to me, very resonant ramifications in terms of your view on not just politics, but also determinism. So if you have a game that's saying, well, it doesn't matter what you do, Italy's always going to come into the war in the end of 1940, that's not at all respecting the fact that, well, that's contingent on what happened in France.
Yeah, if France hadn't been such a walkover, I mean, the way it went, it was like Mussolini was just like, okay, I want in on the coattails of...
Right. So a game that says, look, here's the timetable. You can look ahead. Here are all the times, the dates in which certain powers are going to activate and become belligerent. Then I would argue that's not actually conforming to historicity. That's not actually being historical. That's the historical actors were not privy to that information. They had ideas of probabilities, perhaps, of what might happen. But I'm interested in those games that are exploring the historical plausibility from the perspective of the actors at the time.
Right, so a game like Triumph and Tragedy that's more of a sandbox, it's like, well, Italy might come earlier or later, depending on how it looks for the player that's playing Italy.
Right, I mean, Triumph and Tragedy, I think, is a really excellent example of a game that approaches World War II, to my mind, extremely well, because it gives you the clear sense that the war is sort of smudgy and it's sort of starting in sort of awkward, uncomfortable ways. It's not certain that, okay, it begins, Germany invades Poland, and off we go. And I've played some of those games in my youth and enjoyed them, but I felt that they really are not interested in the more complex and fascinating dynamics of history and how things are contingent and probabilistic rather than certain.
Yeah, it's funny because I think there's more and more people in our hobby now that they want to see why something happened, whereas the hobby has a history of just showing what happened, and I think that's what's opening it up a little bit to go like. If you take a Civil War game, we're seeing in some games like there's pressure on sometimes on what the Union does because Lincoln has to win the election in '64. So right. The game can put pressure on you to have a victory that he can take to the polls. Yeah. Whereas before it was just like you just go through the years and see what happens, right?
Yeah, to me, this is really exciting. This is a deeply welcome development, and it's not quite the same point, but I think some of what is coming into the hobby is bringing it in from Euro games, which is facilitating our ability to think about modeling other things beyond just purely kinetic conflict.
Well, sometimes too, I think it's it comes, partly it's like game design sometimes comes down to what seat you're putting the player in. Is the player Lincoln, or is the player Grant, or is the player Hooker? Like in a battle game, say if we're just going to do Gettysburg, maybe there's less political considerations if we're already there. But if we go out a little bit, then we look at, well, why are we even fighting at Gettysburg, right? Where those questions become fuzzier and maybe more political. But the closer we get to tactical, the more it still seems to go away a little bit in my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, ultimately, when you're creating a game and you're attempting to model some situation, you always have to focus on certain areas, which means that other areas are going to become defocused necessarily. So I don't quite know how you would do a tactical level Gettysburg game and leverage a great deal of politics in there. But I mean, certainly Meade needs to put up some kind of stand.
Yeah.
And Lee has his own agendas and has a certain... He needs to not lose face.
And there was something about him that, like, he felt like he needed he needed to win. Longstreet was telling him he had, like, let's retreat, and it was like, no, there was something driving him to say, we're staying and we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, and that could also be to do with his own sort of sense of infallibility, his own sense that that his army was not beatable. So I don't know, but.
Well, moving on from that, when you were starting to talk in the book about all the different things that you had to consider, and I love seeing you mention Rachel Simmons' games when you were talking about. I'm a big fan of area movement games. Going back to Courtney Allen's Storm over Arnhem. Like it's not that I don't like Hex Encounter, but I love area movement. But she does something different in that. You're not just in the areas, you're on the edges of the areas and the approaches, and does that wonderful thing, like if the areas don't all have to be the same size, the size of the areas represent basically how long it takes you to get across. So if an area's got like really difficult terrain, you make it a smaller area.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that critics of area movement kind of miss that. And they think that there's no maneuver. Like, that's a big thing I always hear about people complaining about area games. There's no maneuver. I don't think you can say that about Napoleon's Triumph or the Guns of Gettysburg. Those games are just filled with maneuver.
Yeah, it's certainly those are innovative games. She's bringing something new there. I mean, maybe that's true that area control games do not, on the whole, afford you a great deal of maneuver, but then that's not what they're mostly for. Rachel Simmons games are, they're an exception in that regard, where they do afford that, but mostly they prejudice other kinds of designs. There's, imagine a coin game on hexes. It would be awful. So because that's not what it's designed to do. The system is designed to focus and shine a light of attention on certain aspects of the conflict.
Well, that's, I think one of your games, Freeman's Farm, that's almost got no maneuver.
Right.
But that's from the point of view of there was no maneuver.
There was almost nothing.
Yeah.
There was one attempted flanking maneuver by the British, which failed. And that, from a maneuvers perspective, that was the end of the battle. And that was, to me, that was an interesting challenge as a designer. How do you make that battle at all interesting from a player's perspective? And so for me, I thought, well, it clearly isn't really about maneuver. It's about cohesion. It's about retaining the morale and your ability to fight against the enemy and to coordinate your forces. So it's a game on tracks essentially, but it's not about can I move around the flank of a force or not, surprise someone. Both forces know where each other's are pretty much. So I shifted the focus onto something else.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, and it's funny you say it's a game on tracks, because it's like, that's probably true, but the way you've laid it out, I don't feel like it's a game on tracks, even though units can move forward and back, and that's about it. and there's all the
Yeah,
whole
no,
thing
almost,
about the morale.
almost never move back, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Just up and then either
Yeah.
succeed or fail.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. When I think about a game on tracks, that makes me think of the State of Siege games and
Right.
that sort of thing. It's like, which is, God bless them, they're fine and they sell really well, but it's just not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't thought of your game as being on tracks at all. I'm going to get that out of my mind because I don't even want it there. Another thing from your book, the discussion about how to write rule books. This is a thing I wade into all the time. The difference between a rule book that's a great teaching document versus one that's a great rules reference, and I always want the latter because I want to play a game over and over, and I want to be able to look it up.
Yeah.
But I've other commentators have said, well, if I can't learn the game, then I'm never going to look anything up.
Yeah.
What's your feeling in writing rules?
Well, I mean, when I write about that stuff, I'm really just leaning on the shoulders of giants and trying to sort of collate the most helpful wisdom that I can from others, and it's just a notoriously difficult area. I'm not sure if you heard Jeff Engelstein talking about this when he's been doing a lot of work to publish Kurt Vonnegut's old GHQ game, and Kurt Vonnegut is a fairly well-regarded writer and struggled immensely with writing of the rules. So I haven't found a particularly good solution yet. I mean, so some people, yes, as you said, they kind of publish two versions. One is kind of the version that you read as you pick up the game from new, and you read right the way through, and you go, okay, I think I've learned the game. And another is in the same box. You can box up a reference guide.
Fantastic when they can do that. A how to play and then a reference. That If every game could do that,
yes,
it would be heaven.
So that's something that I haven't done yet, but I'm certainly looking to do in future. And people, some of the kinds of advice that you hear from people is, well, none of this is kind of astounding, but still, it's all potentially useful. Is, well, give your rules, give them a blind read. Give them to someone who, when they're doing a blind test, when they don't know the game and you're not there to kind of help walk them through it, give them the rules and step away and see what happens. And I would like to see that happening more. I'd like to see it happen more in my own games too. And just, you can catch a lot of things that way that might be all too obvious to you as the designer or the publisher, but you realize that, oh, you missed something. maybe quite
well.
obvious.
I see it missed in older rule books lots. It's like sometimes they'll leave the victory conditions to the last thing because you're going to figure out who wins at the end. But it's like, well, if you don't put the victory conditions right at the beginning, I can't put the rules in any kind of context because I don't know what I'm trying to achieve. I need at least a vague idea of what it is I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's so fraught because games are complex, intertwining systems. So in order to understand the whole system, you need to understand all of those various disparate aspects of that system and how they interact. Well, how do you understand that? Well, you start explaining the system. So you start individually. Well, how do you do that? So then you start explaining, well, let me explain some concepts. We have movement. So there's sort of no very good, there's no ideal place to start, because even if you say, okay, let me explain the victory conditions, you need to have X number of Y points by Z time. And, well, I don't know what those kind of points are and where do they come from? How do I get more of them? Yeah. So it becomes sort of a rat chasing its tail that you're like, well, I don't know, I've just got to start somewhere and then somehow stitch it together.
Yeah, and I guess, everybody bounces off a different sort of style depending on, what they like.
Yeah, right? You can see it in Let's Play videos, and thank goodness for them. But you can see that the people who do those, there's no set template that exists right across that form. People come at that with different sorts of approaches themselves. So you can see that it gives you some idea of how difficult it can be for the rule writers.
You also wrote about player engagement, and I think that has shifted a lot in the hobby too. Like the shift away from big I go you go type games. The shift away from that started really in a way with the first area movement games like Storm Over Arnhem and stuff like that, where it was just so back and forth, and people don't want that downtime. That's a killer. Although I did hear, I think maybe it was Ardwolf on he was like, oh, I like those big games that are I go you go, because when they go, I like to go out and get a pizza or whatever.
Right.
So I guess there is still room for that, but it does feel like things are moving in the other direction to like keep people engaged all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a broad church, and there's lots of people in the hobby, and lots of people come at it with their own different perspectives. We do know that from Eurogames, there are certain kinds of elements that we have in games now that are more pervasive, far more pervasive than they used to be. Things like reducing downtime is something that we see in the mainstream board games space, and we see things like we don't tend to do player elimination so much in those sorts of board games, and we see things like cooperation being a fairly popular now format, where 20 years ago many of these things didn't really exist. We were used to a certain kind of way of doing things, and I think that historical board games are porting some of these things from Eurogames, and this, I think, is only good. It doesn't mean that the other stuff completely dies out, nor should it die out. But
no, I think that's a key point, because whenever we're talking about the evolution of where our hobby goes, there's a certain segment of the hobby that gets their back up because they think people are saying we have to make it this new way. But what we're really saying is this is a new way we can do it in addition to the old way. Like,
yeah, that's my view.
It's not a zero-sum thing.
It's not a zero-sum thing. There's just, why not have lots of different streams all running in parallel as there are just many more different kinds of things. And, I don't even think it's the case that, at least, in my case, it's not that there's one type of game that I want to play. I maybe have a preference for certain types of games, but the fact that there's a rich palette of options is part of the joy for me, and part of what keeps it interesting. So I absolutely don't want it to be the case that we only see a certain type of game, a certain type of design. I like the fact that we have many different types, and I guess through the market we'll discover how popular or more popular some of these are as opposed to some others. But that's kind of by the by. You'll find your own way through that.
Yeah. It's like everything else in life. The more diversity, actually, everything kind of affects each other. Like it becomes this big stew that, the card-driven games started in our side of the hobby. They went over to Euros, and Euros took them and made them into something else that I find sends it back into war games, right?
Yeah, it's a constant conversation that's keeps things in flux, and you keep picking stuff up from certain areas, and then you're adapting them and sending them back, and they get adapted and it's come back, and all of that is, to me, just makes everything richer and more just much more interesting. Because
deeper in a way. Is in the player engagement section in your book, you also talked about like be careful not to be too difficult or too easy, and that's, I suppose that's a sweet spot that varies from player to player. But I know that I have sometimes dismissed games that I thought were too easy, because it's easy to make the mistake of confusing easy mechanics with lack of depth. Mm-hmm. Sometimes some really games that look easy have a lot of replayability. There's and I have to be very careful about that, because I can look at something and go, oh well, that's not for me.
Yeah. Things can be narrow but deep.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you think about things like I'm a huge fan of the Quartermaster General series by Ian Ian Brody, and these are very accessible games. You play a card on your turn is mostly how it goes. But the way in which you can stitch together certain synergies and combinations and understand how that's going to affect the board at any given time means that there's a lot of depth there, a lot of richness as you can kind of go back to that game. So, yes.
And sometimes on the other end, stuff that's got a ton of chrome and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, what's this rule really adding to, it's like, yes, they had a 1 millimeter bigger shells for this particular, or
right.
whatever it is. Sometimes it's the squeeze isn't worth the juice or whatever, the metaphor is.
Yeah. I mean, again, ultimately, I suppose, as you said, there's a lot of player choice and taste, but even that is not, I'm not sure that that's ever static anyway. I think that that's often changing as, not just as we age and as the hobby evolves and goes in different directions, but also that can be mood-based. You can just be, or it could just be practicality. Like you've just got an hour before your flight, so you're not going to play a certain type of game.
I think age does play I think as folks get older, they're like, I used to like those 12-hour marathons, and I'm not up for them anymore.
Right, and I need less text to read because it's hard to read it.
My eyes are exactly. So, well, we've talked a lot about your books. This is basically what you've basically said is you want to teach this course, and you couldn't find a primary text that fit the course, so you wrote your own text.
Yes, that's basically what it boils down to. But, I would stress leaning on a lot of other people to, a lot of research to try and bring the best of what I could of the current conversations. A lot of people who necessarily, as you might expect, get cited in that book.
Well, not just other books, but you cite tons of personal correspondence with designers, publishers, or even stuff that just discussions on Board Game Geek, or I totally appreciate that it's not all you, but it's you who's brought this all together, synthesized it into what you actually wanted to talk about.
That's my that was my attempt to do so. There's just a lot of smart people saying a lot of smart things, and a lot of those things are actually pretty recent.
I agree. It feels like there's been a bit of a flowering of books about historical gaming and gaming in general, just in the last 10 years. But even this year, there's good books coming out.
And there's more coming. Jeff Engelstein's editing a series from CRC Press. I know Amabel Holland is one of the authors of one of the books in that series. So yes, it's actually pretty new and pretty exciting. But yes, there just wasn't a lot around when in 2020 I sat down to try and start to write this. So one of my sort of subtextually, one of my hopes was that game studies, which we've had for about 20 years, has been paying an awful lot of attention to digital games. And I suppose I want to be careful about how I say this, but it's not that I think digital games shouldn't have that interest. It should, but it's had such a almost exclusive interest paid to it that it's rather drowned out or just suffocated any real possibility of board games being spoken about. And one of my subtextual hopes for that book was that it would help game studies pay a bit more attention to our particular hobby, which I think has a lot of there's a lot of interesting and important work going on in this space. I was on a panel yesterday with Liz Davison panel about the intersection between commercial and professional wargaming. And a lot of this work is happening in the analog space, in the board gaming space. And I think that game studies is doing a disservice to not pay better attention to what's happening in board games. So that was one of my aspirations for the book. And as you said, yes, now in fact, in the last few years, we've had a number of books that have come out or just about to come out. And and so I'm quite optimistic that game studies is a bit more attention will be paid to this space.
In some ways, it just like blows my mind. Like when I was young in the 70s and 80s, and was just obsessed with games, I never thought that somebody could teach a course in games, could study games, that ludology would was even a word, like, and I'm so super happy that this is the way the world unfolds. That's something that I felt like made me a geek and an outsider. You can now go study at university.
Yeah, well, there's a special quality to games that I think that culturally has started to become more apparent to people. We talk about in screenwriting, we talk about show, don't tell. It's much better to show something rather than tell something. And in games, we have a different hierarchy, which is do, then show, then tell. If you can get someone, the worst way to try and communicate something, or one of the worst ways, is to tell them. A better way is to show them. But if I can get them to do it, they're going to remember that, and it's going to be more meaningful. So if we're wanting to find ways of educating people with regards to history, if we can put people through our artifices of metaphor, we can put people in the shoes of historical actors, make them feel like they're somewhat in a similar space, and give them a similar set of constraints and circumstances out of which they need to make certain kinds of decisions. They're going to feel something of that. They're going to feel something of how difficult it is, hopefully, or how, well, perhaps they'll even understand why some of those decisions were taken. And so this is a much more effective way of teaching than just telling them.
Yeah, and I think there's another. You talk about screenwriting, but I come from the world of theater, and we have the same thing. Show, don't tell. Is the same thing you tell playwrights. But I think there's something great about theater. Theater's like matches onto board games the way movies match onto digital games, in that there's something about playing a game live with someone too that is a completely different experience. Just like a play, watching somebody actually alive, just that there's a communication that happens between audience and actor is the same thing that happens between player and player.
Yeah, there's a social dynamic and a sort of tactile element to it.
There's breath. There's like we're playing each other, and I don't think about it, but I notice the way you hold your head, or I notice the way you squint your eyes.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about that, but it's like it's telling me something.
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. So that's your book. Let's talk a little bit about your games before we finish, because
Sure.
I know you got a new one that you've been showing here, but we talked about Freeman's Farm. And I've just the last one I played of yours was I just played Operation Barclay, which I had a gas with. For anybody who doesn't know, this is set in 1943, and it's kind of based around sort of the Operation Mincemeat thing that the British did to confuse the Germans about where the invasion into Italy or Sicily was going to be.
Yeah.
And you've made a whole game about the Germans trying to figure out what's happening and the Allies trying to obfuscate it.
Yeah, so it's beginning of 1943. It's the Mediterranean, and Operation Torch has worked out very well. The Americans are in North Africa, and the British are in place in Egypt, and sort of squeezing the Axis armies in Tunis. And the question is, where are the Allies going to go next?
And Churchill says, the soft underbelly.
He says, in the movie Operation Mincemeat, they give him the line, any fool with a bloody map can see it's going to be Sicily. And so the Allies have decided, for various reasons, Churchill not least of all being the reason, to attack Sicily first. And it does make a great deal of sense to attack Sicily, given Axis air cover. The problem is that the Axis are pretty sure that the Allies are going to attack Sicily. And they also have the Allies through Ultra, through breaking the Enigma codes, know that the Axis know that it's Sicily. And they also know that the Axis know that the Allies are going to attempt to confuse them and sow disinformation to make them think that it's going somewhere else. So this is a huge challenge for the Allies' intelligence.
So if they actually think they're going to be played,
Yeah.
then anything they get, they don't know if they're being played or if it's like a double level of being played.
Right.
If you
So this is the high risk. So Operation Barclay is kind of the term for the whole kind of disinformation campaign over those 6 months before the attack, Operation Husky on Sicily. Operation Mincemeat is a subset. It's an aspect of that where, as you said, it's there was the movie, and before that Ben McIntyre books, and before that the Man Who Never Was, and so on. But yes, the idea is they're going to float a dead body off of the coast of Spain, and in that dead body, it's going to look like a major. There are going to be plans that make it look like the Allies are going to attack Greece. And so it's this huge risk, because if the Axis pick it up and realize, oh, they're trying to tell us it's Greece, but clearly we know that that's a ruse, so therefore it's now even more likely that it must be Sicily, then the whole thing's not going to work. So it's quite a delicate operation. It takes the whole Operation Buckley takes 6 months. That mincemeat takes a great deal of that time, and it's one of the kind of ruse de guerre that the Allies are playing.
there's all sorts of things like fake
armies.
radio and things that are meant to be intercepted. And
A fake British 12th Army,
Right,
which
yes,
doesn't
of course,
even
yeah.
exist, and the Axis keep expecting it to land. And in fact, but also they're trying to, the Allies are also trying to make it clear that they hold on to some of that information, the British 12th Army in particular, for when it comes to D-Day, so that they don't want the Axis to know that they have broken the Enigma codes.
Absolutely, yeah. That was a huge challenge all the way through the war, of like using the information, but sometimes not using it because it'd be clear that.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is an example of it's an aspect of military history, but to me, I don't really define that as a war game, because it's not primarily concerned about the execution of military operations. It's about military intelligence operations, and you can see if you've played it that a number of these mechanics are coming from other sources. They're not coming from war game conventions at all.
Yeah. Well, the big. The metaphor, for lack of a better word, is poker. The bluffing. Because I think the genius part of the game. I mean, I'm not saying anything wild here, but it's not having the best hand. It's betting on. You can bet on the other guy having the best. You get more points for guessing who's going to win any hand than you get for winning the hand.
Yes. Yeah. So that was the key for me when I understood I could find a metaphor for it. I didn't really, I wasn't sure how to do it until I kind of sort of realized that I didn't have to portray it in a literal way. I could find a metaphor for spreading disinformation and appearing to show something that really you weren't, or maybe unless you were double bluffing.
Yeah, and double bluffing is definitely a part of that game. Yeah, it's I don't know. When a game has a mechanic that feels totally related to what's happening, that's when I'm most satisfied with a mechanic like that. Like having that as the metaphor is like, well, once you play it, you go, well, this makes sense. It's, probably Maurice Suckling didn't have to come up, like, you probably just hit him, like, it's so obvious once it's there.
Right.
Yeah, because it fits so well.
Right. Yeah, and it just wasn't obvious to me.
No, of course not. Yeah, no, whenever something is like a really good idea, it looks obvious in retrospect, but if it had been, we'd all have done it ahead of time.
Yeah.
And then the game, the 1914
Crisis
1914. Tell me about that game, because I haven't got a chance to play it yet.
Yeah. So that is a game many decades in the making. I'm super interested in the start of World War I and how it came to be, and it took me a long time, mostly with the game in in shoeboxes as I kind of put it away and couldn't figure out how to do it. But I was interested in making a game that wasn't a war game. It's really a game about not starting the war. It's a game about making sure that the war doesn't happen. And so you are attempting to push the prestige of your own particular nation. But every time you do that, you're risking war. You're risking pushing your opponents into a situation where they mobilize. And in this game, if they mobilize, you lose. It's your fault. You started the war.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's like a really rich setting, because the dominoes that had to happen to end up, it's like, it feels like that's been discussed and analyzed for decades and decades and decades. Yeah. And, you know, every once in a while somebody takes a new layer off the onion and goes, yeah, but, and so it's this interconnected thing that would be fertile ground for a multiplayer game.
Yeah, well, so it's sort of a push your luck game, and as you look around, essentially, the more diplomatic pressure you apply, the more likely you are to score points. The victory points that you need in the game. But the more you do that, the more likely you are to cause the war, and so therefore lose. Right. You don't have to go that high. You don't have to push things that far, depending on what other people do. So you're sort of always looking over your shoulder to see what someone else is how far they're going to push things.
Is negotiation part of it then?
No. So that was definitely that's a whole different kind of game you could make on this, where that becomes part of it. It's at the heart of it is a push your luck mechanic, and I suppose.
So that's if push your luck. That makes me think in terms of diplomacy, brinksmanship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So that's the key thing, is that after many years of looking into this topic, it really made me think that brinkmanship is the whole key to this crisis, the July crisis, as it's known after the Archduke is assassinated. It takes about 6 weeks for the war to actually happen, and it's not certain that it will. But the key to it, certainly from the perspective of a game designer, at least to me as I looked at it, was it's about brinkmanship. So the question then is, well, how do I find a mechanic that operates at the level of that's going to give me a metaphor for brinkmanship? And so we have in games we have push your luck type mechanics, which take various different forms, sometimes on cards, sometimes on dice, or other kinds of approaches. And my approach was to do it through cards, because one of the other points I wanted to make was that as the war starts to, the context within which the war happens is one in which we don't have states operating as monoliths. We don't have the British Prime Minister, or even really the Foreign Secretary, who was probably more in the driving seat there. We don't have him saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this. And then we don't have the Chancellor of Germany saying, well, we're going to do this. Each of these actors and all the other major actors are in a situation where they're essentially trying to herd cats. They have doves and they have hawks and they have people who are kind of non-committal, and they're somehow trying to corral them into some coherent state policy decision. And everyone's got their own problems that they're dealing with, and some of them, they don't have perfect control over them. So players are constrained by the way that they manage their deck. They have some ability to manage that deck. And as they bring cards out of their hands, they are pushing themselves either not enough or too much. And they're trying to, essentially that deck management is a metaphor for people management. And as you're trying to manage the situation and manage the escalation that you partly need, but also don't want too much of.
Right. So you're trying to get as much as you can without tipping over into the war.
Right. And you don't want to go, you won't go very far at all if you don't need to, if no one else pushes you very far.
Right.
But the person who goes furthest up that track, who plays the most cards of the highest value, is going to get most points. So you want that to be you.
Without
but then if you go too far, you're going to tip over and start the war.
And
5-player, 3-player?
It's up to 5. It actually has a solo mode, which I think of more as a sort of training mode, and it does play 2. But to me, it's better as a 5-player game, and you just get more of the sense of the.
How long does it? If you have a full 5 players, how long is it going to take?
I think about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I think we played.
Perfect. Yeah, lovely.
I think that's what we played the other day.
That's kind of what I like.
Yeah, that was including teaching, so you can go faster as it
Right.
gets a bit more familiar.
So, is that your latest published design?
So actually, that was out just before Operation Barclay.
Oh,
came out.
yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that
I
came
just
out in
got
summer.
Operation Barclay the other day, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and then, but yeah, that literally has just come out, Operation Barclay, and so that's all I have right now.
But what's on the horizon? I guess is the question.
Yeah, well, so with Fort Circle, Kevin Bertram's company, I have a game, a co-design called Peace 1905. That's about the peace treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War. And that is a game about negotiations where there are some similarities with Crisis in that you don't want to push people too far. If you push for too many things too many issues in your favor of that treaty, the other delegation will walk out of the conversations and you lose because you're the jerk who made that happen. So there's some negotiation as you both try and get some of what you need.
It's a 2-player.
It's a 2-player. Well, actually, it started off as a 2-player game. But there's now a 1-player mode as well. But recently, it's been a little bit longer in development because we've just added a 3rd-player mode. So one of you gets to play as Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who's trying to sort of get each of the other 2 sides, the Russians and the Japanese, to cancel each other out, so that no one does better than the other one. In which case, you as Roosevelt win.
Yeah, you come up the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of taken some time to kind of finesse and get that kind of working how we want it. But so that's coming out. I'm not sure yet. I think maybe next year. And I have a game on GMT's P500 as a co-designer on the rebellions in first century Roman Britain. That's up to 4 players, but it also plays 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's sort of I think of it as a bit like a mix between a coin game and a quartermaster general game. It's sort of irregular conflict, but also has this. It's essentially play a card on your turn. It's not very. It's kind of quite a gentle, quite an accessible game, I'd say, but hopefully accessible, but sort of deep as well in terms of the kinds of interactions you can play out there. Because even though 3 of your factions might be Britons, they're also against each other. So no one gets to kind of easily gang up on the Romans. So yeah, that's with GMT. So those are the 2 that are signed. And today I was showing a game called Elizabeth, England Aflame, which is about state spycraft in Elizabeth I's
Walsingham?
Walsingham.
Walsingham.
Yeah, so you don't actually get to play as Walsingham or Lord Burleigh or Robert Cecil. You're kind of the underlings. You're the spies.
The actual spies.
Right, and you are... The problem is that some of you are Protestants and some of you are Catholics. Some of you are Spanish, some of you are French, and some of you are Portuguese, or in the pay of those nations. And so it's a hidden role game, and you're trying to understand who is helping us, who is not helping us. And
so we don't know. It's hidden whether you don't know if the other players are Protestant or Catholic or
yeah. And even if they're Catholic, they start off wanting the same thing as the Protestants. But if Elizabeth gets excommunicated, well, that changes their agenda. And the Portuguese agent, if there is one in the game, starts off wanting the same as the Spanish agent. But if it becomes possible that the Portuguese monarchy is restored, then the Portuguese don't want the same as Spain. They want the same as the English Protestants, who are the ones who've got to help that monarchy become restored. So it's kind of shifting roles. But also the thing I'd add about that is that you also have the ability to change your role and also to persuade other people to come and join your faction. But it's all done kind of secretly, Not away from the table. It's all done at the table. It's just done with card play and certain cards not being able to be revealed at certain times. And so I'm sort of deep into development of that.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah.
It's a little different, and you get to play as Christopher Marlowe.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Good. That's fine. I'll sharpen my quill and start writing. Well, it's been a treat to meet you, to read your book, and to play with you yesterday,
Great.
and to talk to you today. So
Thank you
thanks very
for that.
much.
It's been great.
And good luck with all those games. I can't wait to see them all.
Thank you. Take care.
When I was in university, I'm pretty sure there was no such thing as a course in game design or theory or history or anything else that related to the games I love. Kids today, I'm jealous. And before I get angry emails saying I've pronounced Maurice's name incorrectly, hold your fire. Here in Canada, as well as in England, where Maurice is from, that's how you pronounce it. Same as you'd pronounce Morris, Morris. But in the US, they're determined to pronounce it like the French, with the accent on the second syllable, Maurice, much like they pronounce Bernard wrong. Again, going with the second syllable, Bernard. It's Bernard Montgomery, I know. With the second syllable, Bernard sounds fancy that way, but it's just Bernard back in England. As Mr. Suckling now lives and teaches in the US, he's given up correcting people on how to say his name and is happy to answer to the American pronunciation, but I'm not ready to give up yet. And I still spell gray with an E. Some things have to be maintained. All right, that's enough of that. Parting shots. Here in Canada, we're in the middle of a postal strike. So I have had a reduction in the amount of new stuff flowing in. That feels good. I get a bit of a breather. But I have a feeling I'll be hit with a bundle once the strike is settled. I've had some shippers outside consider alternatives to the US Postal Service. If you're shipping from the US to Canada, FedEx is great, but please don't use UPS to Canada. Unless the US shipper pays the customs fees up front, UPS hits the receiver in Canada not only with a customs fee, but also with a $70 service fee. It's a real kick in the teeth when the package may only contain a game worth $60. Finally, thanks as always to the Pushing Cardboard supporters, whether it's by becoming a Ko-Fi patron or simply buying swag. It helps pay those hosting and streaming bills. And thanks as well to everyone who takes the time to stop by the website or Discord channel, or who just likes the videos. It's all appreciated. If you'd like to receive the newsletter, you can sign up at the website. It's not only for podcast listeners, it's for everyone. If you are listening to the podcast, look for said newsletter with links to everything I've talked about today. Until next time, may the dice be ever in your favor.